Tables are undoubtedly among the most useful of the furniture. Politicians love talking about kitchen tables. Daenerys Targaryen used one shaped like Westeros to plan battles, I'm told. King Arthur surrounded his table with knights. Douglas MacArthur used this one in Australia to prosecute the Pacific War. As an aside, I actually took this picture. We spare no expense when it comes to researching tables here at Infotech Research Group. Anyway, you get the idea. Tables are very useful, and they can be useful to you too as you plot your organizational resilience. Let's take a step back and talk about what problem we're trying to solve and why it matters. I think everyone agrees that operational resilience is important. I haven't met anyone who would disagree with that, I don't think. Well, for the most part anyway. The problem is that the best laid plans often don't translate effectively into real-world responses to crisis scenarios. A detailed set of steps squirreled away in a binder somewhere might be hard to find and even harder to follow. Besides, life likes to throw curveballs at us. If you don't work for Lumen, shout out to Severance, you probably don't have a flowchart for absolutely every scenario you might have to respond to, and I would tsk at you if you did. That's a lot of effort for not a lot of benefit. So what's the solution? I'm glad you asked. The answer is to think about things a little differently. Just like with software, you want your development environment to look as much like your production environment as possible. You should shift towards immersive, crisis-based training that fosters adaptive decision-making. They say the brain is the most malleable muscle.
It's not a muscle.
Not a muscle? Well, it's the most malleable gelatinous substance in our heads, and we're very well equipped to use it to respond to things that we didn't anticipate. That's part of the wonder of being human. Practically, putting your brain to work in a dev test environment that looks a lot like your production environment means tabletop planning. This is only the case if you don't want to actually infect your environment with ransomware or introduce faults, of course. You can do that. There's a term for it, chaos engineering. Netflix even made a tool called the Chaos Monkey that will test your environment fulsomely. Anyway, assuming you don't want to do something like that, tabletop exercises are really useful. There are a few things you should keep in mind as you embark on this journey. First, the map is not the terrain. As I mentioned, and as you've probably experienced, it's not enough to have a plan. Everyone has a plan. I have a plan. But these are often frustrated by reality. It was Mike Tyson who said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and I think he missed his calling as a philosopher. So the map isn't the terrain in the sense that you have to practice your plan under realistic conditions. To extend our boxing metaphor, you need to spar a bit if you're ever going to be a contender for heavyweight champion. Or, in my case, super heavyweight champion. This aligns nicely with our next insight, which is that teams perform how they train, not how they plan. Frequent immersive exercises directly improve real-world responses. I know when I was in school, I suffered from what I called yeah-ing it. An example, someone would ask me if I understood linear regression, and I would say, yeah, of course I do. I did glance at the textbook once or twice. Then the exam would come around. I'll leave you to guess if I could apply this supposed knowledge. And now I make videos. Insight number 3 is that adaptability trumps predictability. You should design that malleability into your approach, and tabletop exercises are brilliant for this. You want your scenarios, and you should work from scenarios like these ones, up on the screen now, to foster creativity and ultimately improve your ability to respond as things change in potentially uncomfortable ways during a crisis. Next, you should remember that failure is the best teacher, provided it's safe to fail, of course. That's what a tabletop exercise is for. By conducting a tabletop exercise where all participants have the opportunity to test themselves against a scenario in a controlled setting, you'll give them the opportunity to experiment, to learn, and ultimately build resilience, all without unleashing a chaos monkey. Unless you want to, of course. Finally, you really want to make sure you've learned the lessons from the tabletop sessions. Identify gaps and actionable insights from the activity. What went well? What was confusing? Was there anything your participants weren't sure how to respond to? Do you know who you would call if you encountered a specific kind of crisis? These are important questions, and you should ask them all and incorporate the answers into your plans. The difference between messing around and science is just writing down what you found, after all. For more on this, let's talk to an expert on tabletop planning and crisis management. I'm joined today by our expert in crisis management and tabletop planning, Michel Hébert, who is a practice lead in our industry research practice. Welcome, Michel.
Thank you for having me.
So I've got a question that maybe some of our viewers have. I think most of them probably know what a tabletop exercise is, but if you had to describe it fairly succinctly, what would you say is involved in a tabletop exercise?
A tabletop exercise is a practice session where you practice a process that you already have in place. So that might be practicing a security incident management program or your disaster recovery plan or your business continuity plan.
So I would bring folks into a room. We would have probably a literal table or maybe a whiteboard. Can I do it vertically?
The setup is really up to you. Tables are very popular these days. Typically, every member of the group will have a certain role to play. There's a facilitator who has a scenario. They walk through that scenario, and everyone takes turn kind of like applying the process and practicing.
So I might have my incident coordinator in the room with me and maybe somebody from the help desk, somebody on the communication side, and they would all be in the room. And then a facilitator would give a scenario like our core services are down or a factory has been impacted by a weather event or something like that. And then everybody would sort of walk through what they were doing in response to that event.
Absolutely. So you can think of them as a fire drill, except they're a little bit more involved in that. So you come up with a scenario that tests the processes that you want to practice, and then you get the right people in the room. Depending on the process, you'll have different people in the room. So if it's a very operational process, if you're doing a security incident response to something like a ransomware attack, you're going to have a lot of technical people in the room. But you might also have leaders in the room. So as you test something like a ransomware attack that might have business continuity implications, you might have the CFO, the CEO, you might have legal, you might have compliance in the room as well.
Interesting. So I'm sort of compelled by this idea of a tabletop exercise because it feels lower risk than actually experiencing the event to me, right? So I'd rather talk about my data center not being available than actually going and unplugging everything in my data center and sort of seeing what happens, right? So it's a bit of a risk mitigation piece. But I guess you're sort of leaving some of the realism on the table. So can you tell me a little bit about how we can make sure that the outcomes that we anticipate from a tabletop exercise are actually accurate? Like, how do I know how somebody actually would respond in the event of an issue like you've described?
That's a really good question. I think you need to be prepared first. So you need to decide what process you want to test. So if you're doing security incidents, for example, you want to have a plan. You want to understand how to activate the security incident response team, how to prioritize incidents, how to escalate. Um, After that, you really want to design the scenario in the most realistic way possible. So you need to take into consideration the industry that you're in, your process maturity. You want to understand how a typical security incident, like a malware attack, for example, would unfold. And you want to craft your scenario around that. So the more variables you can bring in as you're designing your scenario, the more realistic your scenario is going to be.
So what do people get wrong when they're doing this? You sort of hinted at something just now, right? This idea that the more realistic your scenario is. So I guess some folks maybe have unrealistic scenarios. But what are some of the other challenges with doing this right?
Oh gosh, you might think that people get it wrong by going too simplistic, but it's quite the opposite. So if you've never done a tabletop exercise before, your instinct is going to be to build an apocalyptic scenario. You want your team to lose communications. You want to lose all computing power. That ransomware attack is going to spread to the CEO's house and take down his family pictures that he keeps on his personal laptop. If you build a scenario like that, you'll induce panic in your team. So it's important to kind of scale it in the right way. Another mistake that people make is that they will test the same scenario over and over again. So ransomware, of course, for the last 5 years have been a real concern. And so organizations are tempted to just practice their data breach and ransomware scenarios over and over again. The problem is that can give you a false sense of confidence. So what you want to do if you're worried about something like ransomware is you want to change the scenario over time so that you're looking at different facets of it. So if you've done a basic ransomware attack, kudos, you've learned your lessons, you've moved on, you've improved your processes. Maybe next you tackle a ransomware attack that affects a third party. So how does that change the equation? So if a partner that I'm connected to falls to a ransomware attack, that threatens my organization in a different way. And that is also a scenario that I need to practice. The other thing that people get wrong is that they don't practice the facilitation. So they think it's just a matter of kind of going through the scenario that they build, but there's more to it than that. So you need to ask the right questions. You need to bring out the right responses from people. And you have to do it in a way that invites them in as opposed to puts them on their heels.
Excellent. Well, so facilitation is a lot like speaking to a camera. You should practice. Thank you, Michelle. What do organizations that do this right, what do they do differently from other organizations?
So I think if you want to build a good tabletop session, you really need a program. You need to think about the processes you need to build, and you put them in place. Then you have to set out to achieve certain things, right? So you need to say, okay, look, I'm going to improve my security incident management process or my disaster recovery process or my business continuity process. And I'm going to do that over time. So a tabletop exercise or a tabletop program is not a one and done. It's something that you do maybe semi-annually or annually, and you actually have a goal that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to improve a certain part of the organization, or you need to practice your response to a certain threat that you're worried about. So that threat might be ransomware, it might be response to tariffs.
So we do a lot of research on organizational resilience, different varieties of it, right? Ranging from things like business continuity and then, of course, disaster recovery. And when I think about something like a disaster recovery, which I know is a little bit narrower than what we're talking about here, when I think about something like that, sort of the gold standard is an actual failover, right? I have two sites. I've got a primary and a DR site. And to prove that I am resilient, I'm actually going to do a test where I literally fail my virtual machine environment over into this other area. So I guess the question I would have is sort of what's the role of a tabletop exercise compared to something like a true failover test? When should I do one or the other?
A failover test is fantastic. If you are setting up a new environment and your infrastructure is fresh, you might want to do a failover test to make sure that things actually work when you turn them on. The challenge with failover tests, though, is that they're very expensive and they're very disruptive. And they also run the risk of having an actual business disruption, which is what we're trying to avoid. And so tabletops can come in as kind of like a second best to a failover test in that scenario, where we're testing all the right things, we're practicing, we're getting lessons learned, but it doesn't actually have an impact on the business. Now, there's a few caveats there. You want to make sure that your scenario is realistic enough that it will actually simulate the conditions that you're going to encounter for a failover.
So for many of the folks watching this, maybe they haven't facilitated one of these exercises before. What advice would you give someone who was tasked by their leadership with running one of these? And I know that the scenario is going to matter a fair amount in their level of expertise and their seniority. But do you have any general advice for the general viewer?
So let's set the scenario building aside for now. We've talked about it just now. So just looking at the facilitation, you want to lower the stakes. So you want to stay calm. You really don't want to bring in that apocalyptic scenario. You want to facilitate it in a way that people feel that they can participate. You have to create a space where it's okay to get the wrong answer. And so that safe space is very important because it will allow people to think through the problem that they're facing in a creative way. Now, you can do that by having, you prepare a scenario, you prepare the script, you prepare the kinds of questions that you're going to ask them. I like to leave the questions open-ended, so I don't cold call people immediately. Or if I do, I announce it. So I'll say, okay, so Jeremy, let me ask you this question. You are the service desk manager. You're responsible for escalating the process. Walk me through how you might escalate an incident. How would you prioritize it? How would you escalate it? Who do you get out of bed when? So I just ask the question in a way that gives them a chance to respond. The important part really is to create a space where people feel they can try out an answer. I don't use the term tabletop test on purpose. So for me, they're tabletop sessions. We're going to practice. You can't fail a session. You can fail a test.
If you had said you can't fail a practice, I would have said you should have been on my high school soccer team. You can, in fact, fail a practice, at least in that context. Okay, what do folks who get this wrong do incorrectly? What's a bad way to run a tabletop?
Oh gosh. So if you come in and you do a tabletop and it's an interrogation, then you're not going to get good results. Another way to do a tabletop that's less effective is to expect people to have canned answers, prepared answers. So I share the questions for a tabletop before the session. So I give people the questions, I give people the scenario. They know what's going to happen. It's not a surprise. I don't want to keep them on their toes. Sometimes the leader will say, look, Michelle, can you at least have one surprise? So one of the escalations is something they don't expect. But really, I want them to prepare for it. But I don't want them to come in with everything written out so that we're just kind of like walking through the tabletop looking at our cue cards, right? I want it to be more dynamic than that. In reality, in a real scenario, you're not going to have cue cards. You're going to have your run book. That's great. Your run book tells you how you might tackle the problem that you're facing. But really, you want to have that agility. You have to preserve the ability to think creatively through the problem. And so that's what I try to recreate in a tabletop.
So in the introduction to this video, I talked a little bit about the Chaos Monkey, which is, if you're familiar, it's a tool, a piece of code that Netflix wrote that randomly shuts off servers in their production environment just to make sure that the system is resilient, right? And so I see it sort of as a continuum. The Chaos Monkey is maybe the extreme of resilience preparation. Then you have a failover test. Then you have something like a tabletop. So maybe a question for you is, once I'm really solid on tabletopping, is it more appropriate for me to start to escalate some of my resiliency sessions, or is there always going to be room for a tabletop?
There's always going to be room for tabletops. I like to use tabletops to build my playbooks. So once I've got my disaster recovery, business continuity, or security incident management plans in place, I want to build out playbooks that will tackle high risk scenarios. And tabletops are great for that because you can go, okay, what are we doing in a data breach? Let's run through a scenario and see what we can learn. So there will always be room for tabletops. Now, once you're good at it, you might want to build out other activities. So you might, from a security incident perspective, you might want to look at red teaming, right? So can we simulate an attack that penetrates the organization? Can we shut down systems? So there is a continuum. I mean, you can break out the Chaos Monkey on the other side of it if you like, but tabletops will always have a place.
So tabletops, and then maybe there's a monkey on top of the table that's messing with your cue cards or
I
something
will
like
bring
that.
a monkey to my next facilitation.
Yeah,
I
it
think
would
it's
certainly be a departure from the typical practice. So as you've alluded to throughout our conversation, this is something that you're very experienced with. You've facilitated many of these, and I understand that you've written a piece of research to help others with their tabletop planning for organizational resiliency. And so it comes in several phases. You can deliver it over a few days. Can you walk me through what that looks like? So what's day one, phase one look like, day two, and so on?
There's a few variations to this engagement. So let's say the full 4-day engagement. What does that look like? On the first day, we really think through the purpose of the tabletop program we're building. So what are we up to? Are we focused on a specific process or all three of the processes that I mentioned: security incidents, disaster recovery, and business continuity? Once we have a sense of the program we want to build, on day two, we start building the scenarios. So what kinds of scenarios are we interested in testing? I want to make those scenarios as relevant as possible. And so you need to ask some really good questions about: what industry am I in? What threats do I face? What do I need to prepare for given my organizational profile? And so day two is really about thinking about the kind of organization I'm in and how the processes I'm trying to practice will support the organization. And then that helps us get to building the scenarios. Now we have a really cool LLM-powered scenario design tool. You can answer a bunch of questions about your organization and about what you're trying to achieve. And then the tool generates an LLM prompt, and you can go to ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity, Claude, and you can get those LLMs to produce different scenarios. Those scenarios will have the structure we recommend, which is one situation and two escalations, and they will also have proposed questions that you can use to build your scripts. Day 3 is really those tabletops. And so the workshop includes a facilitated experience. And so our facilitators will get the right people in the room and will run 2, sometimes 3 tabletops, depending on what the client wants us to do. Day 4 is all about bringing all that together. So it's all messing around until you start writing things down. So you really want to think about what lessons you've learned from your tabletops. How are we going to apply those lessons? What processes do we need to change? And so the whole engagement helps you to design your tabletop program. It gets you to practice a few tabletop sessions. There's a bit of a train the trainer here. So our expectation is that after you do the workshop, if you're interested in doing your own facilitated sessions, your team will have the skills to do that. And then the workshop also produces process improvements on the other side.
Excellent. Wonderful insights, Michel. Really appreciate having you.
Thank you for having me.
For more on this, check us out at infotech.com.